All right, well, good evening, everyone, and happy Monday. Hope your week is off to a good start. We will go ahead and get going for tonight at 6 o'clock. Looks like we've got over half the class here, so I'm sure folks will be filtering in along the way. But welcome to week number 2 for organization theory. Let me just first thank you for your beach board essay number 1 and your responses to 2 classmates. I appreciate those. I went through and reviewed all those, and grades have been provided on that beach board essay number 1. Again, I think everyone's organization was fine. My whole purpose in beach board number 1 was just to take a look at your organization and make sure that your organization would work well for the course assignments. And from what I saw, everyone's organization looked like it would work fine. For those of you with large organizations, I thought you did a nice job of narrowing it down into a unit or division or department within that organization, which would make it much more manageable than for the organizational analysis paper. But so we're all good there. Beach board essay number 2 is coming up next, obviously this week, and it will be due then on Sunday. As always, I ask that you try and get your initial post done earlier in the week, and then you can finish up your 2 responses to classmates by midnight on Sunday. For the second beach board essay, you'll be comparing a public organization to a corollary organization in the private sector. I assume most folks, if you're working in a public organization, that will be the public organization that you choose for your purposes of comparison. So compare your organization to an organization that is somewhat similar in the private sector. So if there's an organization in the private sector that has a somewhat similar purpose, or an organization in the private sector that has some similar functions, compare your organization to that organization, highlighting 2 similarities and 2 differences between the 2 organizations. Now, if there is not necessarily a corollary organization in the private sector, an organization does not exist that does a similar purpose or similar functions as your organization, then you might want to think about a private sector organization that is of equal size, equivalent size to your public organization, maybe a private sector organization that has a similar organizational structure, maybe a tall hierarchy as compared to your public organization. So take your organization compared to a private sector organization, highlighting 2 similarities and 2 differences. Obviously, if you're working in a private sector organization, you just flip the logic. And so you'll compare your private organization to a somewhat similar organization in the public sector. So that's for our beach board essay number 2. And again, all 3, your initial posts and your 2 responses must be done by next Sunday. Review that, and then again, if there's any information to bring into class next Monday, I'll have a chance to be able to do that. All right. Okay, let's see how we're doing so far. All right, looks like almost everyone is here. So tonight we're going to start our journey into the wonderful, exciting world of organization theory. And so as you know, tonight we're going to start with the classical school of organization theory. Some of these theorists you have encountered before in your 500 course, or maybe in some of the other courses you've had so far in the program. We're going to highlight some of the major theorists within the classical school, and that's what we'll do for tonight. So we'll talk about, theorists like Max Weber and Frederick Taylor and Luther Gulick and Fayol and Mooney, and some of these really heavy hitters in this classical school of organization theory. But what I really do want to highlight throughout a discussion of all these quote-unquote classical theorists is I really want to highlight similarities and differences. So I want to highlight some of the threads that tie all these classical theorists together, and then also highlight some of the differences that will differentiate between these different theories within this general rubric of classic organization theory. Now, as you probably already noticed, some of the headings used by Tompkins are a little bit different than what we are going to use tonight. So for instance, Fayol, Mooney, Gulick, he puts those folks within his administrative management school. We're going to combine that all into the classical school. And so it's all going to fit within this umbrella of classic organization theory because they do share a lot of similarities with each other. And we'll highlight those similarities. Just, to kind of do a little foreshadowing, one of the primary similarities that we see that kind of makes all these classical theorists hang together is their attempt to try and find that one cure-all, that one size-fits-all approach for all organizations. And they really did believe that they could come up with this panacea that could then be applied to all organizations in order to make those organizations effective and efficient. Another thread that kind of ties them all together is their focus. The focus of all the classic organization theorists is a focus on the organization itself. How to make the organization effective, how to make the organization efficient, how to make the organization productive. But at the end of the day, for all these theorists, the focus was on the organizational goals as opposed to the goals of individual employees. And so that macro level organizational focus is, again, something that ties these different theories together. We'll also see, though, that there are some things that differentiate these theorists from each other. Well, when we talk about Max Weber in just a second, we'll see that he has a structural type of orientation. When we talk about Frederick Taylor, we'll see he has a much more process-oriented, procedural type of orientation. And so there are some things that will differentiate these theories from each other as well. But as we talk about each one of these theories, what we will do is we will then, when we're done talking about the theories, we'll go back and we'll see what those theories then mean for understanding the models of organizational effectiveness, the mechanisms for coordination and control, and the methods for motivating employees. And we'll then use those three Tompkins frameworks in order to, again, compare these different theories and theorists to each other. We'll do all that in the first half of class tonight, and then when we're done with that, we'll then take a break. After our break, we'll then come back and do our breakout groups, and that will be our session for the evening. So before we get into a discussion of classic organization theory, any questions or anything before we get started? All good? Okay. All right, hopefully you can see my slides, classic organization theory. So our first author is one who you've run into before at least once in the program. Perhaps you run into Max Weber many times. But Max Weber is usually our starting point when we talk about classic organization theory. Max Weber really took a very structural type of approach to the way in which he talked about organizations. One important thing about Max Weber is that he was a very big believer in rationality. And again, when we're being rational, we are using information. We are using empirical evidence to fuel our decision making. So we're going to base our decisions on empirical evidence, on evidence that is tangible. When we say something is empirical, we mean it's something that's tangible. It's something that can be experienced. Empirical evidence can certainly be quantitative. It can certainly be numbers-based, but empirical evidence can also be qualitative in nature. It's something that is communicated through words and phrases. So empirical evidence really subsumes both quantitative as well as qualitative types of information. And sometimes in the world of academia, there are some pretty pitched battles about what the true definition of empirical should be. And I know a few years ago in the College of Health and Human Services, which is where we are located as an MPA program, there's a very heated discussion in the retention and promotion and tenure and promotion process about what types of research should count as credit toward retention, tenure, and promotion. And the argument was about, do they have to be quantitative or can they be qualitative articles as well? And believe it or not, there were some folks on the committee who argued only quantitative articles count as empirical types of research. That obviously is not true. And fortunately, the rest of us on the committee won the day with the argument that empirical research can be both quantitative as well as qualitative. Quantitative and qualitative is just a different way in which you are communicating your information. On one hand, you communicate with numbers. On the other hand, you communicate with words and phrases. So both quantitative and qualitative information can fit the bill when we're talking about this idea of empirical evidence. And that's what Max Weber wanted us to base our decisions on. We don't base our decisions just upon belief and faith. We base our decisions based upon tangible empirical information. That's what he believed was rational type of decision making. So he placed a lot of value on rationality. And he really did believe that bureaucratic organizations epitomize the highest level of rationality, that that's where this rational decision making would occur. So Weber kind of lays out his theory in talking about authority. And he says, whenever you're making decisions, those decisions are underpinned by authority and power. That in order to make decisions, you have to have decision-making authority, decision-making power. So the question then becomes, where does that authority, where does that power come from? And for our purposes, we're going to just talk about power as being the ability to influence someone else. So if you can influence someone else to take an action, especially if you can influence someone else to do something they otherwise would not do, you are then exercising power and authority over that individual. So where does that power and authority come from? That power and authority can come from the individual leader themselves. That power and authority could come from tradition, just because it's always been this way, and so it will continue to be this way. For years, kings ruled through the divine right of kings. And so the king's authority came from the fact that he was from the royal family, and the leadership would then be handed down through generations of this royal family. That's the tradition. That's the way in which it's always been done. Give you an example of that here in the U.S., some authors like Elazar and Grodzins in the intergovernmental relations literature will argue to us that there are different political cultures depending upon the region of the country that you are looking at. So the Northeast has its own culture, the Southeast has its own culture, the Midwest has its culture, the West has its culture, and those different cultures are all predicated upon authority and who has the power, who has the authority. One culture is the individualistic culture. And with the individualistic culture, power resides with individuals, and individuals participate in government because of what they can get out of that participation. So it's kind of like your political machines type of argument, like the Tammany Hall political machine in New York City, that you get this position in city government because of what you can then get out of it. Can you get information that will help you line your own pockets and to benefit as a private individual? In the South, though, the dominant authority model in that political culture is what's called the traditionalist culture. And the dominant authority is those have authority who have been doing it in the past. And so it's very much of a status quo type of situation. So when you look at where authority lies in a lot of governments in the South, and this is even true up through today, county government is one of the most powerful levels of government in a lot of southern states, because it's always been that way going back to the time of the colonies. And so you'll see a lot more authority residing in counties in the South than you'll see in the Northeast or even in the Midwest or even out in the West. So traditional ways of doing things can really guide you in determining who has the power and who has the authority. And then a third type of authority is the one that Weber really favors, and that's the legal rational approach. In that rather than authority being placed in a person, as it is with charismatic authority, rather than authority being just the way in which it's always been, authority in the legal rational approach resides within the office. It resides within the position rather than the person. And that's a really important distinction, because if power and authority resides in the office, in the position, it is much more stable and much more permanent. People come and go into organizations. Positions tend to be much longer lasting in nature. And so the authority may come from the position of mayor not necessarily the occupant of the mayor's office. The authority may come from the city manager's office, not necessarily that specific individual who is occupying that office at that particular point in time. Faisal, go ahead.
Yes, on the first model, you mentioned that charismatic model, it's kind of like a patronage kind of system that prevailed in the specific in the northern areas. Why do they call it charismatic? Because charismatic has very good connotations, and how did that name fall into that?
Yeah, I think it's just the derivative is from charisma. Is that, that's the derivative of it. And so a person's, charisma, their personality is what they lead with in a charismatic type of leadership. A good example of that is when people follow a charismatic leader, one reason they follow them is what's called the self-concept theory, in that they kind of see themselves in that leader and their personality is similar to the personality of the leader. And that's why they tend to follow that person. Some people tend to follow charismatic leaders because they want to emulate some of their characteristics and they want to be more like that person, and they value some of the characteristics that that person has, and that is then why they follow that individual. But charismatic is basically just from charisma, from the personality of that leader. And again, the problem with there's one good thing and there's one bad thing about charismatic leadership. The good thing about a charismatic basis of authority is that it engenders very loyal followers. So the followers of a charismatic leader tend to follow that person no matter what. And so you get a lot of loyalty among your followers. The disadvantage, obviously, is that if you have a charismatic leader in an organization and they decide to leave and go to a different organization, they will take their charisma, their personality, their authority basis with them to their new organization. And then you've lost that power basis, that basis for authority in your organization with the leaders who are left. And so it tends to be a very transient, very unstable type of authority. So charismatic, we've seen a lot of charismatic leadership. We see charismatic leadership today. I think you can make an argument that most elected officials, at least at higher levels, tend to have some charismatic leadership qualities. Even if you don't like the individual, in order to win, 50 or 60 million votes, you're probably going to have some charisma. You're going to have some of that charismatic leadership. So we still see that used today. The traditional form of leadership, we still see it. Again, we got strong counties in the South. We still see a lot of dictators using more traditional type of leadership, where they are using incentives to get their political allies to follow them. And that's kind of a more traditional way of leading. In our organizations, that's where we tend to see this legal, rational type of basis of authority, where authority resides within the official offices within that organization. So charismatic authority leads to charismatic administration, which is inherently unstable. As we said, people can leave organizations, and when they do, they take their authority and their power basis with them to their new organization. Traditional type of authority oftentimes manifests itself in things such as patriarchal, patrimonial, and feudal forms of administration. In patriarchal administration, you would have administration basically through your family. So you were the leader, you were a member of the royal family, you would lead through that royal family. And you wouldn't really extend beyond that in terms of your leadership. You would just focus on that really tight nuclear family, and that would really be where all the power would reside. Patrimonial administration, you go beyond just the boundaries of your nucleus family, and you start relying a little bit more on a little bit more distant relatives, but it's still kind of still all in the family. It's just a little bit more decentralized than a patriarchal type of administrative structure. In a feudal administrative structure, which again is traditional in nature, this is where you start to venture out beyond just your circle of family and close circle of friends, and now you start relying upon your political allies. And, these were feudal systems of government where you would incentivize all these political allies who were oftentimes very far flung throughout the kingdom or far flung throughout the country, and you would use the incentives in order to get those people to be loyal to you and to follow you. Sometimes they were positive incentives, like money, and like we sometimes see in Russia with the Russian leader who's able to incentivize all these these billionaires in order to his oligarchs to support him with all this money and all these powerful positions. We've seen the stories of the $500 million yachts that are being seized through the Ukraine war. And so that's kind of that example of relying upon your political allies. You can also then motivate those political allies through negative punitive consequences. And so if you disagree with the leader, there will be some punitive measures for that type of disagreement. But Weber, again, kind of eschews those type of administrative structures and really focuses his attention on the legal rational authority system, authority basis, which brings him to this administrative approach known as bureaucratic administration. Again, the bureaucracy is the highest level of rationality for Max Weber. So he wanted to see power exercised by these technical administrators, these experts, these professionals within these bureaucratic organizations. So his approach to administration was very much of a bureaucratically inclined type of administration through the bureaucratic organization. But he felt the most effective and efficient way that an organization can exercise its authority and its power is through structure. And he really focused on the ideal structure of a bureaucratic organization, what he called, as you probably already know, his ideal bureaucracy. And so for Weber, his ideal bureaucracy consisted of certain elements, such as a division of labor. Our organization has a lot of work to get done. We have a lot of individuals working individual positions within our organization. So we're going to divide up the work. We're going to divide up the labor. You need to look no farther than Congress as an example of division of labor. Congress divides up the labor all the time through committee structure and through subcommittees. It's a very common practice in most bureaucratic organizations. So you can be more efficient and effective when you divide up the work. Well, when you divide up the work and you give certain tasks to certain individuals, those individuals then specialize in those tasks on a daily basis. So division of labor then breeds his second principle, which is specialization of task. As people specialize in these tasks, they then become experts in what they are doing because they are doing these jobs every single day, day in and day out. Who knows better what's going on a daily basis than those professional administrators who are specializing in those types of tasks? You then also have to have a structure to your organization whereby you have a unity of command so that everyone knows to whom they are held accountable. It usually takes the form of this tall hierarchy where you'll have one person at the top. As you move down the pyramid, you then encounter more and more people in more and more positions. Each manager, each supervisor in the organization will also then have a limited span of control. So they won't be responsible necessarily directly for everybody underneath them, but they may have 3 or 5 or 7 or 10 people who they are directly responsible for. That is their limited span of control. So again, you're trying to get a regimented type of structure into your organization where everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing and everyone knows to whom they are responsible for their actions. We have a very rule-bound organization as well. So the ideal bureaucratic organization is predicated upon rules. We have rules, we have regulations, we have policies. The good thing about being rule-bound is when you are rule-bound, you can better protect individual rights. You can make sure that people are not having their rights violated because all the rules are being applied in the same way to everyone. It also suggests a bit of equity in terms of how those rules are being applied. The problem, obviously, is when you have too many rules and regulations, you end up with a lot of red tape. You end up with a lot of gridlock, and the cogs of the bureaucratic machinery oftentimes will grind to a halt because of these rules and regulations. As we'll see later on in our semester, Robert Merton will talk to us a lot about bureaucratic dysfunction. And he will argue that bureaucratic dysfunction occurs when we get too focused on these rules and these regulations, and applying the rules and regulations becomes our ultimate goal, as opposed to serving the wants, needs, and desires of those citizens we are coming into contact with on a daily basis. But we do have these rules and regulations. These rules and regulations are implemented by professional administrators. So they are professionals, which means they have a skill set that matches the jobs that they're doing on a daily basis. And these professionals are also career administrators. They are in the organization for a career. They're not free agents who are going to bounce back and forth between different organizations. They're going to remain in that organization for their career. And everything gets written down. We rely upon written documentation. Written documentation not only allows us to treat people equally and fairly, but written documentation also builds in institutional memory, so that when people do retire and they do leave the organization eventually, what's been done in the past has been written down, and new employees can come in, access that written documentation, and rely upon that written documentation for making decisions. But that's basically what Weber referred to as his ideal bureaucratic organization. Ideal bureaucratic organizations that exhibit these different characteristics will hopefully be able to be efficient as well as being effective and productive by following these different types of characteristics. Now, clearly, when you've got an ideal bureaucracy that focuses on the structure of the organization, and when the structure of the organization is what helps you achieve your ultimate goal of effectiveness and efficiency, when you look at Max Weber and his ideal bureaucracy in comparison to the models of organizational effectiveness, you are clearly going to be at the bottom of that chart. And remember, the models of organizational effectiveness that Tompkins gives us those 4 different cells. The cells at the bottom emphasize control, and that's where Max Weber is going to be. His theory emphasizes the internal process model because we're looking internal to the organization and the structure inside the organization. It also then favors the rational goal model, because the whole reason why you have processes and you have this structure is to help you achieve the organization's goals. Those goals are effectiveness, productivity, and efficiency. So Weber is very much oriented around this whole idea of control, primarily control through structure. In terms of the mechanisms for coordination and control of work activities, I think there's very little doubt that he focuses on direct supervision. It's a very top-down approach to his tall hierarchy. So clearly it's direct supervision. There's also a good bit of standardization as well. So we're standardizing work processes, we're standardizing work skills. By having those standards and writing those standards down in your written documentation, you can then, according to Weber, be more effective, more efficient, more productive as an organization. And then in terms of motivational strategies, the primary motivational strategy is a negative one. It's legal compliance. Here are the rules and regulations. We are then going to hold you accountable for meeting those rules and regulations. If you go out of compliance with those rules and regulations, then there will be punitive measures. Now, you may lose your position, you may get demoted, you may lose some of your compensation. These are all negative things that will happen if you go out of compliance with these rules and these regulations. So again, it's a very regimented, very top-down, centralized way of structuring and running our organizations. But Weber was very much interested in the structure of the organization and creating this ideal bureaucratic structure for the purpose of helping the organization achieve its goals. So it makes a lot of rational sense. It is certainly based and predicated upon rationality and empirical evidence, but there are obviously problems with Weber in his ideal bureaucracy. For each one of these theories and theorists, there's a reason why there are new theories that were constructed. And all these newer theories and all these schools of thought that follow were constructed as responses and rejoinders to some of the theories of the preceding school of thought. So there are obviously some limitations with Weber, and I think you're keenly aware of those limitations when you're focusing only on the organizational goals. And when it's the organization that is your focus, you lose sight of your individual employees. And Weber didn't talk a lot about individual employees outside of just hiring the right person for the job and then telling that person how to do the job and supervising that person. Other than that, there really wasn't much focus on individual employees. And there certainly was not a focus on anything that comes close to our human resource management that we are so familiar with today. And that's one of the primary limitations of Weber. It was very much a structural organizational focus and really didn't pay much attention whatsoever to individual employees. But again, Weber was trying to make his organizations effective, efficient, and productive, and he was trying to do it through structuring the organization as an ideal bureaucracy. Now, despite the fact that we know that Weber didn't focus much on individual employees, and we oftentimes talk about all these newer and neoclassical theorists that were developed to fix some of those problems with Weber, we also need to recognize that there's a whole lot of ideal bureaucracy embodied within our modern organizations. Okay, no matter how modern your organization is, there will certainly be a lot of vestiges of Weber's ideal bureaucracy within a modern organization. We have organizational charts. We have organizational structures. We have a supervisor type of, structure in our organizations, whereby people know to whom they are accountable for their actions. We have, these written rules and regulations. We have written documentation. All of this is still very much alive and well in our modern organizations, despite some of the problems associated with a classical theory like Max Weber and ideal bureaucracy. But Weber really looked at structure. Frederick Taylor, another classical theorist, really looked at process. Now, the ultimate goal of Weber and Taylor, those goals are somewhat similar in that they both wanted to promote organizational goals. They both want to make the organization efficient and effective and productive. It's just the way they went about it was a little bit different. Weber went about it through organization structure. Frederick Taylor goes about it through process. And he focuses squarely on the process of work itself. And he believes that if we can come up with the one best way to do the job, that we can then teach all of our employees this one best way to do the job, and that will then make us efficient and effective and productive as an organization. So Weber had his basically one best way to structure the organization. Taylor has his one best way to do each individual job within the organization. So why did Taylor come about? Why did Taylor develop his theory of scientific management to begin with? Well, one reason is at the time in which he was developing scientific management, when you look at organizations, and most of his work focused squarely on the private sector. So he was looking at a lot of factories. And when you looked at factories, we were going through the Industrial Revolution. What he saw in a lot of these factories, a lot of these organizations, is there was a gap between upper level management and workers. And we really didn't have a whole lot of a middle management level. going on within these industrial organizations. Because we have this gap between upper level management and workers, there is very little supervision and guidance being given to those workers because we didn't have middle managers to serve as the conduit between the top and the bottom of our organizations. So what would then happen is those employees, because there was little supervision and guidance being given to them, they would engage in this process known as soldiering. And soldiering was a very pejorative term that Frederick Taylor used. And whenever an employee was engaging in soldiering, that employee was just doing barely enough to get by. So they were doing just enough to keep their job, but they weren't trying to excel in terms of their level of performance. They were just soldiering, just doing enough to get by on a daily basis. And I'm sure in previous courses, probably in your undergrad or even high school, you probably read books like The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. So I'm sure you're very well of a lot of the labor unrest that was going on at the time of Frederick Taylor's writing as well. And so you've got a lot of good reasons why there's a void that needs to be filled, this perceived void of a theory that needs to be implemented within these organizations to make them more efficient, more productive, and more effective. So for Taylor, that void would be filled with his theory of scientific management. And hopefully scientific management would be able to eliminate this soldiering by defining expected standards for performance for our employees. So we'd establish a performance level that we're expecting from our employees, and then we will try and hold those employees accountable for those performance expectations. So the way in which scientific management would work is we would establish standards for selecting what Taylor considered to be the right person for the job. So first we have to get the person who has the skills and the abilities to do the job. Those are the people we need to hire into our organization. Taylor felt that all too often we had a mismatch between the skills of the employee and the requirements of the job that employee is doing on a daily basis. So we have to first hire the right employee who has the right skill set to be able to then do the job. And then we systematize the production process by finding that one best way in order to do the job. And I'm sure you've run into Frederick Taylor in scientific management before, so you're probably familiar with his approach known as the time motion studies. So anybody tell me how time motion studies worked in scientific management? What was a time motion study and how did it work?
Well, I let me chime in. What I remember is that in a production setting, they use lighting, etc., to see how the moods, etc., work on people's production. That was one I can think of.
Yeah, and we'll talk a lot more about the Hawthorne experiments with Mayo. We'll talk a lot about that, and then that is a good example of some of these external stimuli, and look at how external stimuli could affect the job and how people are doing the job, and really some fascinating results that come out of looking at that relationship between external stimuli and productivity. And what Taylor would do in his time motion studies is he would literally position himself by that employee who is doing the job, and would position himself there with a stopwatch. And so he would time every single motion and every single movement taken by that employee. And one of the most basic examples that he used was the example of shoveling of ore, what was called pig ore, which is a very crude type of ore. And so he would literally position himself behind an employee who was shoveling pig ore, and he would time how long it took that person to pick their shovel up, how long it took them to put the shovel into the pig ore, how long it took them to lift one shovel full of pig ore up, how long it took them to take that shovel full and dump it into a cart, how long it then took them to go back to the pile and start over again. And he would deconstruct every single aspect of that job to try and eliminate what he called the false movements. So any movement that an employee took that was non-productive, we would get rid of those movements, and we would only focus on the movements that were productive. And so, an example could be that, maybe they're taking too long to take the shovel full of ore over to the cart. So maybe we should position the cart, find a way to position the cart closer to the pile so they don't have to walk, so they can just turn their shovel over. That would save some time. And that's the idea. So you do that with every single one of your jobs. You stand there with a stopwatch, you time the employee, you then put all the good movements, if you will, all the movements that contribute to efficiency, you put them all together into the single one best way of doing that job. And you would do that type of time motion study for every single job within your organization, and then identify the one best way to do each one of these jobs. You then incentivize people to follow that one best way by giving them instrumental rewards. And the primary reward that Taylor wanted to give employees was money. So if they're doing a good job, they're being productive, they're doing the job in this identified one best way, we will reward them with money. So we'll pay them for doing a good job. People are specializing in tasks on a daily basis, but the supervisors also have that same task specialization, because a supervisor is going to be monitoring the productivity and the performance of the employer. The supervisor must be an expert in that position as well, an expert in that job. So you have this task specialization like with Weber, except you not only have it for the employee, but you also have it for that employee's supervisor. And that was the idea behind scientific management. And so what Taylor could do is Taylor could then identify the one best way to do a job. Then we can go and hire people who have the right skill set, bring them into position, standardize their teaching of how to do the job, monitor their performance to make sure they're doing the job in the one best way, and then reward them if they are, fire them if they are not. And that's this approach of scientific management. Now, scientific management is just like Weber is alive and well in our organizations today. Scientific management is also alive and well in modern organizations. Most of you probably have a job description, a position description. That position description is predicated upon a job analysis. So typically we do a job analysis, we deconstruct our jobs into their component elements. We then use that job analysis to then engage in a job evaluation. We will compare the job analysis between all these different positions for the purpose of writing position descriptions, and then placing these positions on our position classification chart. So we can then assign compensation based upon where these positions fit in our position classification chart. So job analysis, job evaluation, position classification, pay grades, all these things are directly related to Frederick Taylor and his theory of scientific management. So it's very much alive and well in our modern organizations. The problem with scientific management, and it had multiple problems, one of the major problems is the same problem we had with Weber, in that it was a very dehumanizing theory. It didn't really pay much attention to our individual employees and their wants, needs, and desires. And a couple of passages from Taylor's work that really illustrate this very well. At one point in his work, Taylor refers to employees as being what he calls boorish beasts. So if you refer to your employees as being a boorish beast, clearly you don't have a lot of value for that individual. He also referred to employees as being cogs in the machinery. So just like you would have a cog, that turns and it has teeth on it, and the tooth of one cog pushes against the tooth of the other cog, which makes that cog turn, which then does the same thing to another cog, and so on and so on. You can kind of picture all these cogs all turning together. If a tooth breaks off of one of the cogs, the whole system is going to shut down. The whole machinery is going to shut down. So you take out that broken cog, you throw it away, you replace it with a new cog. So you're not fixing the cogs, you're just replacing them. People were replaceable cogs within the machinery of the organization. So he had very little regard for individual employees. When you have little regard for individual employees, you completely overlook the social environment of an organization. And that's what next week a lot of our human relations theorists are going to tell us, people like Elton Mayo and Fritz Roethlisberger, is that we need to recognize that people are social individuals. And as being social animals, if you will, they are working within a social environment. And if we completely disregard the social aspect of work, it's going to be very hard for us to motivate our employees. It's going to be very hard for us to develop our employees as human resources. So again, this devaluation of individual employees is another problem with Taylor, just like it was a major problem with Max Weber. When you compare Frederick Taylor to Max Weber in terms of models of organizational effectiveness, you're going to get the same type of thing. You're going to be looking at the bottom of your chart. You're going to be looking at those models that really favor control. Taylor favors both rational goal as well as internal process models, but I think you can make a strong argument that his real preference was for internal process because he's really, really interested in those individual jobs and how they are being done on a daily basis within the organization. And that's really where his attention was focused. In terms of the mechanisms for control and coordination, certainly standardization. There's no doubt he wanted to standardize worker skills. He wanted to standardize work processes. So I kind of part company a little bit with Tompkins. Tompkins doesn't highlight the worker skills. I do. I think it's standardization kind of across the board, not just standardizing the job, but also standardizing work outputs and standardizing the skills of workers as well. And I would also highlight direct supervision. I think with Frederick Taylor, there's a good bit of direct supervision because after all, who is telling the employee the one best way to do the job and holding them accountable other than their direct supervisor? So I think there is a lot of that direct supervision. The creation of this middle management tier, and a lot of that middle management tier that we see today comes to us from scientific management. Those middle managers have to have a task specialization to directly supervise the work being done by employees. Now, I think Tompkins' argument as to why he doesn't favor direct supervision with Frederick Taylor is because the argument is once someone knows the one best way to do the job, once they have the skills and have been trained in how to do it, then they should be able to do it. But if you're going to be assigning rewards for doing a good job, you're still going to have some type of a supervisory mechanism. In terms of methods for motivation, clearly there's legal compliance. If you're not doing the job in the one best way, you're not doing it productively and efficiently, you're going to be shown the door very, very quickly. You are a replaceable cog in the machinery of the organization. But also for the first time, we're going to highlight instrumental rewards because Taylor really did believe that it was important to reward people for being productive. It was important to reward them for learning the one best way to do the job and then following that one best way on a daily basis. So the first time we're really bringing in some instrumental rewards along with the more punitive legal compliance type of motivational mechanism. So yeah, both Weber and Taylor both look at the one best way and they're really interested in the organizational goals. Weber looked at structure, Taylor looked much more at work processes as his main area of focus. Now, another author we usually talk about in this class when we talk about the classical school is Henri Fayol. And this is where I part company a little bit with Tompkins again. Tompkins likes to talk about Fayol and Mooney and Golik as administrative management theorists. I like to look at them more as principle theorists within the classical school of organization theory, because I think they still do share some of the same characteristics as classical authors like Weber and Taylor. But one new thing that Henri Fayol gives us is he gives us kind of that 30,000 foot vision. You know, you always talk about that helicopter vision when you kind of try and get the big picture of something. He tries to look at the big picture of organizations. So whereas Weber and Taylor really got into the minutia of management, Fayol argues that there's more than just management for effective organizations. Really, we need to look more at the governance of the organization. So how do we govern organizations? And what types of activities do we engage in when we govern our organizations? He would argue that management is just one activity within the broader governance of an organization. It's one thing that we do alongside a lot of other activities. So yes, we are going to manage. We are going to allocate resources among different units and different people within our organization. We're going to manage work. We all do management in our organizations, but that's only one part of the overall governance of the organization. In addition to management, allocating resources within our organization, we're also going to engage in what he calls technical services. Technical services will be the actual mechanisms that we engage in to create our outputs, the actual mechanisms that we engage in order to create our products and our services that will be consumed by our citizens, by our consumers. That's the technical aspect, actually creating those products and those services. We also engage in commercial activities. Commercial activities meaning exchanges between our organization and other organizations. If we engage in commercial activities between our organization and the private sector, and we're going to purchase supplies from private sector organizations, that's a commercial type of activity. We engage in financial activities where we have to generate revenue and spend money within our organizations. We got to balance our budgets in our organizations. We engage in security activities where we not only have to make sure our employees are secure, we also have to make sure our intellectual property is secure as well, that other organizations are not stealing our intellectual property. Today, in terms of cybersecurity, that's a security activity, making sure that no one's breaking into our systems and stealing our employee information or our organizational information. And we engage in accounting services, where we have to hold ourselves accountable for how we spent our resources in creating our products and our services, our output. So these are all activities that all contribute to the overall governance of the organization, and management is just one of those 6 different activities that help us govern our organization. So Fayol then said, let's focus, even though we're saying management is only one activity, let's focus in on that activity of management. And let's ask the question, what are the essential functions that we engage in when we manage an organization? Well, all managers will need to engage in planning. We need to plan our organizations, engage in strategic planning, know what our mission is, know what our goals and objectives are. We all engage in planning. All managers also engage in organizing. They have to try and organize all the resources throughout the organization. So how many resources go to this unit versus how many go to this unit? What unit should be within what department, and so on and so on. We all engage in the function of commanding, where we have to basically direct and dictate what goes on within our organization. So we command our units and our departments within our organizations. We all engage in the coordinating function as well, where you have to coordinate all these disparate activities within our organization to make sure everything is working together to help us achieve our ultimate organizational goals and objectives. And we engage in controlling, where we have to not only control the behaviors of employees, we have to control our finances, we have to control security, we have to control all these different resources and elements within our organization. So Fayol says all managers engage in the functions of planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. These are kind of those generic management functions that all managers do, regardless of whether they are public or private sector managers. So those are essential functions of management. Well, so what? Well, so what is that based upon those 5 essential functions, Thiel then transform those and develop those into what he referred to as the principles of management. So we talk about Thiel, and then we'll talk about Mooney, and then Luther Gulick. When we talk about these 3 authors, we're really talking about what we call a principles approach to organization theory, where these authors believe that if we could identify the elemental principles of management and then teach these principles to our managers can be successful, and therefore organizations will be efficient, productive, and effective. So he distilled those 5 functions into several different principles of management. Principles such as division of work. Just like with Max Weber, here's your division of labor. A second principle, authority creates responsibility. And this is where Thiel kind of parts company a bit with Max Weber. Thiel believed that if you give people authority, decision-making authority over a certain area, by giving them that authority, they will then create responsibility for the product they're creating. That if you give them authority, that authority will then breed responsibility. They will then hold themselves responsible for achieving a certain level of performance. So he believes in giving authority to employees, far more than what you have seen with Max Weber or even Frederick Taylor. Now, next week, as we move into neoclassical theorists, we'll see that there are some theorists who will contend with that and say you cannot give authority. You cannot give someone authority, but instead what you have to do is help them develop their own authority, help them develop their own power base. But here, because Thiel is a classical theorist, he believes managers and leaders can give authority to their subordinates. You have to have a system of discipline where you can hold people accountable for their actions. You need to have the unity of command that Max Weber talked about in his ideal bureaucracy. Another principle is you have to have subordination to the general interest, that the interest of the many is more important than the interest of the few or the one, not to butcher the old Mr. Spock phrase, but subordination to the general interest, that your interests are, as an individual, are not necessarily more important than the interests of the entire organization. Proper remuneration, that people are properly compensated for their performance levels. Centralization, again, this is a classical theory, and so you've got a lot of the top-down, tall hierarchy, centralization of power type of idea. So when you centralize power and authority, again, you're saying, well, how does that relate to point number 2, authority creates responsibility? Because you're deciding, as the top level of the organization, you're deciding what authority and how much authority and to whom that authority will be given to. So it's still a very top-down type of approach. A top-down type of approach based upon a chain of command, a scalar chain, whereby, again, everyone knows to whom they are responsible to. Order, in that you have rules and regulations, and people are held accountable to those rules and regulations that will then create order within the organization. Equitable treatment of individuals in the organization. You treat people equitably, not necessarily because it's the right thing to do, but you treat them equitably because that will motivate them to then give contributions back to the organization. Just like Max Weber, stability of personnel. You have people in your organization who are there as professionals for a career. You hope that they take initiative, and hopefully by giving them authority, they will then develop responsibility, which will then engender them taking initiative and being creative. And then you create this kind of psychological feeling that we're all in this together, what we refer to as a esprit de corps, that we're all part of this organization, we're all in this fight together, and we're all here to support each other because we belong together in this organization, this esprit de corps. So as you can see in some of these principles, there is some psychology at play. Authority creates responsibility. That's a psychological type of an approach. Remuneration as an incentive is a psychological type of an approach. Equity as a motivator is a psychological type of an approach. Esprit de corps, certainly, this feeling of belongingness and inclusion, that's a psychological type of behavior as well. So Fayol basically tells us by focusing on some of these psychological elements, we can put together these principles of management, teach our managers these principles, and if they are well versed in these principles and how to use them, that's how we're going to have an effective, productive, and efficient organization. How do we implement these principles? Obviously, we have to train our managers. We have to write these principles down. We have to have written rules and regulations and come up with a written organizational chart where everyone knows what activities they're responsible for. They know to whom they are accountable and what they're supposed to be doing and how they're supposed to be doing it on a daily basis. And that type of clarity for Fayol would then produce this effective and efficient and productive organization. Mooney, who is a student of Fayol, also looks for principles. So just like Fayol was trying to find these universal principles of management, Mooney was trying to do the same thing. The difference between Fayol and Mooney is, as we said, Fayol really kind of focused a lot on psychology and psychological factors. Mooney focused a lot more on like a Weberian organizational structure. He was much more interested in the structure as opposed to the psychology of the organization. Mooney comes up with 3 different principles. His principles are the coordinative principle, the scalar chain principle, and the functional principle. And again, if organizations can adhere to these 3 principles, this is what will make organizations effective and efficient. So the first principle for Mooney is what he calls the coordinative principle. The coordinative principle looks at how well the organization is able to coordinate its daily activities. How well coordinated are all the different machinations that are going on a daily basis within the organization. Managers need to coordinate those activities. So you don't have duplication and replication. So you have each unit and each department contributing their part to the ultimate goals and objectives of the organization. The second principle is one we're very familiar with. Fayol told us about it. Weber told us about it. The scalar chain principle. Scalar chain principle is simply this chain of command, that everyone knows to whom they are accountable to. And you need to have that in your organizational structure. But the real importance of Mooney and why Mooney is still talked about today in organization theory is that third principle on the screen called the functional principle. The functional principle, Mooney says, we need to realize that we have different types of positions within our organization and then treat those positions differently. So he compares positions based upon the position's function. And he comes up with this binary functional definition known as line versus staff employees that we're very familiar with today. Line employees have the function of actually delivering the products and services, delivering the outputs of the organization. So these are your Michael Lipsky street level bureaucrats. These are the folks who are interfacing on a daily basis with the public. We call those your line employees. Line employees have unique types of needs in order to do their job effectively and efficiently. Needs that are different than the second functional employee known as a staff employee. Staff employees are the employees that provide the resources to make the work of line employees possible. So they're the ones who are providing the logistical support to help those street level bureaucrats effectively interface with citizens and effectively deliver the products and services of the organization to citizens and consumers. So for line employees, they're interfacing with people on a daily basis. They're engaging in what's considered to be an intensive type of technology. And last week, when we were talking about differences between public organizations, we said one difference is the technologies used. And we said the highest level of technology used is an intensive technology. That's what line staff are engaging in, these intensive types of technologies. How they deal with an individual A, may need to be different than how they deal with individual B and how they deal with individual C. So it's a much more sophisticated type of technology that these line employees are going to be engaging in dealing with individual citizens. We need to recognize that in how we supervise and how we train those line employees. Staff employees are engaging in much more of what we would call a mediating type of technology. And remember last week we said Tompkins had three technologies: the long linked, the mediating, and the intensive. The long link was that kind of factory type of analogy we don't see all that much in a lot of our organizations. The mediating technology was where you put resources into contact with individuals. Well, that's what staff oftentimes do, is they put resources in contact with line employees. And they try and provide the right set of resources to those line employees to then hopefully help them be effective and efficient. So since staff are using mediating technologies and line employees are using intensive technologies, we are going to direct and manage and train those types of employees differently. That's important because this is really the first time we started to really differentiate between different types of employees and how we manage and lead those different types of employees. So this is starting to make a departure, if you will, a little bit of a departure from your more mainline classical theorists like Weber and Taylor. So Mooney is starting to kind of move us a little bit more toward the pre-human relations theory as compared to Weber and Taylor. But I think that's really the most important thing that comes out of Mooney is this idea of the functional principle and the difference between line and staff employees, that different positions have different needs and they have different requirements, depending upon if it's a line position or if it's a staff position. But Fayol and Mooney, even though they are very important classical theorists, a lot of their theories were just that, in that they were theories that some organizations adopted, but oftentimes they kind of lived in that theoretical world. Our next author, Luther Gulick, is different, in that Luther Gulick, even though he talked about principles of management, what differentiates him is he was able to take his theories and directly apply them to public sector organizations. Luther Gulick was a very important member of the Brownlow Commission in the 1930s. And the purpose of the Brownlow Commission in the 1930s was to reorganize the federal bureaucracy to make it easier for the president to manage this ever-increasing federal bureaucracy. If you think about what was going on in the 1930s, we were trying to respond to the Great Depression, and the way in which FDR was doing it was through the New Deal. You know, the New Deal created all these different alphabet agencies and all these hundreds of different programs to try and help state and local governments and businesses as well try and pull their way out of the hole of the Great Depression. So as we were creating all these different federal agencies and as we were creating all these different federal programs, we realized that the size of the federal government was growing exponentially. The size was just exploding. And it was becoming more and more difficult for the president to manage this ever-increasing federal bureaucracy. So the Brownlow Commission was formed to try and reorganize the federal government. They came up with a reorganization plan that did fundamentally reorganize the federal government. And Luther Gulick was a very prominent player on that in that reorganization plan. And again, not to get too far afield, but in that reorganization plan, what it did is it created this the executive office of the president and then placed a lot of management agencies within the executive office of the president. So something like the Bureau of the Budget got placed within the Executive Office of the President in order to try and help the President manage the financial aspects of the federal government. Today, the Executive Office of the President is still around. It's still with us. It has things like the Office of Management and Budget. It has the Office of Personnel Management, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, the White House Office. All these management or what we call overhead agencies located within this Executive Office of the Presidency. All of that comes from Luther Gulick and the Brownlow Commission. And what Luther Gulick was able to do is he was able to take his principal theories and through the Brownlow Commission and the reorganization of government, actually implement a lot of these theories directly into the federal government, which really does set Luther Gulick apart from people like Fayol and Mooney. He actually had his fingerprints all over some of these changes to the federal bureaucracy. Gulick believed in principles, just like Fayol and Mooney. He believed that if we could establish these generic common principles that all managers need to know, and then train these managers on these principles, what they were and when to use them, we could then be effective, efficient, and productive as a bureaucratic organization. So for Gulick, his principles came to be known as the POSCORP School, which is the acronym that you probably have all heard of before, for planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. Just like with Fayol, Gulick recognized we all as managers need to plan the operations of our organization. Just like Fayol, he also recognized we have to engage in organizing. We have to organize all the different aspects of our organization to help us achieve our organizational goals and objectives. But then we also know that all managers have to staff. They have to hire people, bring them in, onboard them, train them. That staffing functions true for every single manager, regardless of what organization they are in. We have to direct their activities once they're in the organization. We have to coordinate all the activities going on a daily basis, all our units and departments, again, making sure we have goal congruence and we're all working toward the same goals. We have to have reporting mechanisms where you have to report out what we're doing, how well we're doing it, what inputs we are spending in order to get the outputs that we are creating. We have financial reports we have to do. That's all part of this reporting mechanism. And then the last principle of budgeting. We all have to bring money into our organization. We all have to manage that money effectively and efficiently. So planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. POSCORP is Gulick's principal school of management. And his argument is these principles all kind of serve as a managerial toolkit. So if we can teach our managers how to do these generic management principles effectively, then we're giving them a managerial toolkit. Then they can, once they're in their organization, open up that toolkit and when necessary, pull out the planning tool and help the organization plan. When necessary, they have to hire people, they pull out the staffing tool and they staff their organizations. When they need money, they pull out the budgeting tool and so on and so on. So by giving this managerial toolkit, that's how we make our organizations effective and efficient. Sounds like a pretty realistic and pretty simplistic way of going about management. The problem was that there were some primary critics of Luther Gulick and his principal school. And the two main critics are two very well-known people in the field of public administration, Herbert Simon and Dwight Waldo. And at this point in the program, halfway through the program, you probably run into Herb Simon and Dwight Waldo before. If not, it's good you're running into them now because they're two very powerful voices in the field of public administration. Herb Simon. Herb Simon is one of those theorists who made his name finding flaws in other theories. I don't say that in a pejorative way either. I'm not saying that in a negative way. But oftentimes people will make their name in a field by pointing out deficiencies in established theories. And Herbert Simon was very, very good at doing that. You may have run into Herb Simon before on his theory of bounded rationality. Whenever you had talked in previous classes about decision-making models, you probably talked about rationality versus incrementalism. Well, Herb Simon was one of those folks who said, rationality doesn't work. because we're human beings and we have bounded rationality. We have cognitive limitations, and there's only so much information we can acquire, only so much information we can understand. And because of that bounded rationality, we're never going to be purely rational. That's why we tend to be a little bit more incremental. And so he's very well known for that type of attack, if you will, on rationality. But Simon says, if you want to go that way, Simon says that the principal school, especially with Luther Gulick, had a lot of flaws. One of the major flaws is that he said these are not principles. The planning, organizing, staffing, those aren't principles, according to Simon. The principles of esprit de corps and initiative and all those things that Fayol gives us, those aren't really principles. According to Simon, they're proverbs. And he says they're proverbs, meaning that just like you can find a proverb to counteract another proverb, a proverb to disagree with another proverb, you can find a principle to disagree with another principle. So if you're saying, well, you need to have centralization on Fayol, but you're also saying we need to create initiative on the part of our employees, centralization and initiative kind of run counter to each other. Centralization and the giving of authority kind of runs counter to each other as well. And so these are really kind of conflicting proverbs as opposed to being true principles. And that was Simon's critique of the whole idea of the principal school. Dwight Waldo, another very important public administration theorist, chimed in as well, and he argued that these principles are not truly principles, but they're really more prescriptions. They're not scientific. That Fayol and Mooney and Luther Gulick kind of offered them up as here are scientific principles. So, these are true in all situations for all managers. Waldo says there's nothing really scientific about it. These principles are value-laden. These principles are there to emphasize top-down executive control and centralization. That they're not there because they were developed out of any rational scientific theory. They're there to try and support a centralization, support top-down directive type of management, support an exploitation of workers. And they were meant to exploit workers without a whole lot of scientific background or support to them. So the principal school really fell on some hard times because of the criticisms from people like Herb Simon and Dwight Waldo. I do think, though, when you look at modern organizations, that we do engage in a lot of these principles. If you're a manager and you think about what you do as a manager, you probably do engage in planning. I mean, I know, here in our department, we're going through reaccreditation. We're engaging in strategic planning right now. In the past several months, we've been going through the strategic planning process. So as a department chair or program director, you absolutely engage in planning. You engage in organizing. You have to organize course schedules and staff. You have to bring in new faculty. You do the staffing. We do all these types of principles. So I think those principles are still alive and well in our modern organizations. It's not necessarily whether or not they exist. It's more how you carry out those principles. And I think what really differentiates between the classical school and neoclassical theories like human relations and human resource management is not necessarily what we are doing, but more how we do it. In the classical school, we do it for the purpose of the organization. We are trying to extract contributions from employees to the goals of the organization. In neoclassical theories like human resource management that we'll look at next week, we're not really looking as much at the organization goal, but we're also looking at the goal of individual employees. And we're looking to try and find that nexus between the goals and the wants, needs, and desires of individual employees and the goals and the wants, needs, and desires of the organization. So again, it's not really a difference in what we're doing. It's really how you do it in the neoclassical approach as opposed to the classical school of organization theory. Before we get to our breakout groups, though, just to remain consistent, when we go back to Tompkins and we take a look at those models of organizational effectiveness, again, the same thing as we saw with Taylor and Weber, we're really emphasizing the control types of models, internal process as well as rational goal. In terms of the mechanisms for coordination and control, very much direct supervision, very much centralization. In terms of the methods for motivation, very much legal compliance. Not a whole lot of talk about instrumental rewards. There's not a whole lot of talk about goal congruence and goal acceptance. Not a lot of talk about job identification. It's primarily holding people accountable to the rules and regulations of the organization. So again, what ties all of these classical theorists together in the classical school? They're looking for the one-size-fits-all approach. For Weber, the one-size-fits-all approach is the ideal bureaucratic structure. For Taylor, it was scientific management and the one best way to do the job. For Fayol, Mooney, and Gulick, it was the identification of the principles that all managers need to know and all managers need to execute on a daily basis. It's that one-size-fits-all approach, that panacea search, that really ties all these classical theorists together. What differentiates them is, again, their individual focus. Weber focused on structure, Taylor focused on process, the principles theorists focused on management principles. So again, we know we've got a lot of criticisms of Weber, of Taylor, as well as of the principle theorists, but we also know we see all of these theories alive and well in our modern organizations. So after the break, the question we're going to answer then is, how do we see these alive and well in our organizations? What examples do you have in your organizations of these types of classic organization theories? But I see we're now a little bit past 7:30. Are there any questions up to this point in time about the classical school and these classical theorists? I know you've run into some of these folks before, but now we're going to talk about them relative to all the rest of organization theory and kind of compare their approach and their focus to our other types of theorists and schools of thought. Faisal, go ahead.
Yeah, can you just touch a bit on Waldo's criticism of Gulick?
Yeah. What he was saying is basically that it's exploitative. He's saying that when you talk about these principles, you're talking about principles that managers, supervisors need to engage in. And by giving these principles to managers, you're giving them tools to then exploit their employees. You're saying, okay, they're going to direct their activities, they're going to organize their activities, they're going to do all these things, but they're doing them not to help the employee, they're doing them just to help the organization. And so it's kind of a foreshadowing of a lot of what we see with neoclassical theorists when they say, all these classical theories, including Gulick, including the principle school, they're exploitative in nature, and that they just want to see how much blood they can get, if you will, out of employees to help the organization be effective without a whole lot of concern for the well-being of those individual employees. He makes the argument, nowhere in these principles do you see anything about helping employees develop as human resources. You don't see anything about that. You don't see anything about these individual employees have the ability to engage in self-determination of determining what types of jobs they should be doing on a daily basis. They're just basically being told, this is what you're doing and this is how you're doing it. So it's kind of that top-down exploitation. Again, we'll see that it's a common theme and a criticism when we get to neoclassical theory next week as well. Kamara, go ahead.
Hi, Mooney's organization theory. Could you provide or dive down more into the different types of workers and their functions from line to staff? Could you provide a good example of that?
Sure. Yeah, a line employee could be someone, maybe it's a social service worker. And so, that person is actually meeting perhaps with a citizen, going over their, maybe that person has put in a claim for maybe welfare assistance, some type of welfare assistance. And so a line employee would then meet with that citizen, would go through their application, talk about some of the resources they have, some of the resources that they need, some of the things the organization can provide to them, some of the programs that person may be eligible for, and they're meeting on an individual basis, interfacing individually with that citizen. A staff member may be somebody, say, for instance, in human resources, and that person in human resources processes the payroll for that staff employee, or processes some of their benefit claims of that line employee. the HR person is not necessarily interfacing with people outside the organization, but they're providing the pay and the resources for that line employee to keep that line employee paid so that they can go and interface with citizens. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, sure, happy to do it. Good questions. Any other questions on classical School of Organization theory? Okay. We're looking at about 7:25, so let's see. Let's come on back at 7:40. That will give us 15 minutes. So come on back at 7:40, and I'll break you up into groups, and we'll spend about half an hour doing our breakout groups, and then we'll reconvene and talk about what you came up with, and hopefully be out of here by about 8:30 tonight. So take a break, come on back at 7:40, and we'll do our breakout groups. Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good break. I've got our breakout rooms set up, and so again, what we'll be doing, as you can see on the screen, is each group will examine their organizations, identify aspects of classic organization theory that you see within your organization. So we're looking maybe 2 or 3 examples, and it could be anything from Weber or Taylor, any of the principles theorists. As always, select the spokesperson, and then the spokesperson will share out the group's results with the class. I think because this is pretty straightforward type of an assignment, you're just picking 2 or 3 classic organization theory examples from your organizations to share. I think we probably can do this in about 20 minutes, if that's okay with everyone. So we'll say we'll do this till about around 8 o'clock or so, then we'll reconvene and see what everyone came up with. All righty? Okay, let me go ahead and open up the rooms, and then you can have at it. So the rooms are now open, so I'll see you in about 20 minutes. Okay, we are back. I think everyone's back in the room now. All right, looking good. All right, let's start with group 1. Again, just a couple examples of classic organization theory that you saw in your organization. So group 1, I think that's Karina, Jelani, Jake, Faisal.
Hi, Professor. So I was part of group 1, and we really identify, a lot of us work for the public sector. So whether it be UCLA or, the county of Los Angeles, county of Orange. So a lot of what we saw and identified with was with the Weberian ideal bureaucracy. There's definitely a division of labor. There's a very tall hierarchy for a lot of organizations. A lot of our, the jobs that we're doing on a daily basis, we're pretty much career individuals. I mean, that's why we see on and on of county employees being with the county for 25 years, 30 years, 45 years. And there's definitely a lot of rich documentation. We have numerous policies and procedures that we follow. There's worker tools, everything so that, new staff can rely on in order to do their job. And each of us always have a span of control, so we all know what our function is and in our position depending on what our job is. Anything else that anybody wants to add?
Also, the way we are organized, all of our departments, since we are in public works, we are public entities, we have like the human resources, the personnel department, the administrative functions department, or public works, or the police. These are being organized in such a way that our roles don't overlap, and we have a chain of command where we are held accountable, and where we are well aware of our roles, and where we will be punished if we don't do, or if we do something that is beyond our span of control.
Great. Very good. Well done. And yeah, we oftentimes talk about Weber, late 1800s and the early 1900s and how long ago it was. But as you illustrated very well, a lot of those elements of the ideal bureaucracy are certainly alive and well in your organizations. And legal compliance, that's one of the primary methods for motivating employees in the classical approach. And again, it seems like that's very much alive and well in your organizations too. So even though a theory is, what, 130 years old or whatever it is today, we still see it even in a quote unquote modern organization. So excellent. Thank you very much. Well done. Group two, any the same or anything different?
Hi, everyone. Good evening. So with group two, we did also find that we found a lot of Weber's ideal type bureaucracy to really dominate our organizations. In our group, there were larger and smaller organizations, but what was found is that ultimately a lot of these workplaces had a lot of interrelated ways that the organizations were ran. At the larger end of the spectrum, we did see a lot of fixed official duties, hierarchies in place, a lot of written documentation, whether it be with like manuals on, how to perform a specific task, or even on the end of like personnel tracking, performance documentation, anything of that sort. For like the smaller groups, it was found one of my cohorts works for an elected official. So what was found there was that there were many limitations in communication. Only certain individuals could communicate with, certain stakeholders or, other groups. And while there were some fixed duties, there tend to be a lot of overlap as well. And it resulted in some duplication of efforts. Another one of my cohorts who works for the Department of Food and Agriculture and also worked in the private sector previously, did see that there was a lot more red tape and many more processes in place. But fortunately, some scientific management approaches, as outlined by Taylor, were being noticed in order to find like better suited leaders. And lastly, what was found really with the smaller organizations was that there really was a lot of relatedness to many of these classical theorists. There was an ad hoc leader, currently in place, and there was some lack of experience. A lot of these leaders that have gone through this small nonprofit have also been charismatic leader dominated. And because it was such a small organization, there wasn't a lot of division or clear outline in duties, which sometimes can be a negative thing because it might interfere with some efficiencies. But yeah, that's what we kind of just saw, like a mixed bag, but there were definitely a lot of interrelatedness in all of our organizations. Thank you.
Good, very well done. Yeah, and you really raise a very important point about, as we talked about last week, there are distinct differences between organizations. One of those differences is the size, and sometimes we get those differential sizes in organizations. You see a different implementation of classical theory, and sometimes you don't see quite the regimented processes and the regimented organization chart sometimes in small organizations that you might see in larger organizations. But one of the things we're going to then grapple with next week, I know we have two more groups, so I'm not stopping now, but I'm saying one of the things we're going to grapple with next week is we're going to grapple with the idea of how can we then, even though we know we have all these classical elements in our current organizations, how can we then incorporate those HR and human resource management elements into and overlay on top of such a classical type of structure? And that's something we're going to deal with next week. But very good. Thank you very much. Very well done. Okay, group number 3.
So we also covered a lot of the Weberian ideal bureaucracy. There was a lot of that being mentioned, of the tall hierarchy, very rigid specific tasks. Even applying for a job, it's very specific to who can apply, who can't, if it's within the organization, if it's open to the public. So that was mainly what was covered. But then for my organization, which is a nonprofit, I did see more of Mooney's principles. where we do get together to coordinate our activities, either daily or weekly, and each person contributes their part. Whereas in the Webers, everything's very laid out. In my organization, it's like, if you can think of a better way to do it, let's try it out. And then it's also where there's line workers and then the staff workers, the line workers working more directly with the public or the clients, and then the staff workers providing that support. So we saw a little bit of those too.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the line and staff in Mooney, and I think that's really common in a lot of our organizations. Also, the communication element, that's a really good one, especially when you look at the size of organizations. And I can certainly see in a small nonprofit how communication flows maybe a little bit, may flow a little bit more readily than it would in a large, very structured type of organization. I think that communication element is really important. And it's going to be very important next week when we get into people like Follett and some of our HR theorists. So that's a great point. Very good. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, room number 4.
Hi, Dr. Powell. So I was part of group 4, and 4 of the 5 of us definitely saw a lot of Weber's theory of bureaucracy, from city council to mayor, that kind of instills or at least the administrative law grants power. It's not absolute power. So Jocelyn works for Orange County Health in the Homeless Services Division, Kieran, OC Sanitation District, and Robert works for the Disability Rights California, which is an advocacy group for disability. So a lot of these have a very tall hierarchical structure, and there is definitely that theme of division of labor kind of going in and out of these organizations where you have that director or executive level, mid-level management, and then the line workers. Large span of control. So no one person has that ultimate authority. And then we are all kind of falling in line with federal, state, and local policies. And then Daisy, however, does work for a private firm, which is the Old Republic Title Company, which protects property owners. It is a private corporation, but it's definitely a large scale operation where Weber's top-down structure definitely still applies, but then we have a little bit of Taylor's theories mixed in, where we have the work standardization, and then the rewards based on performance, which a lot of us in the public sector don't really get to see. We don't get we get gift cards and that kind of stuff, but we don't see that go directly into our paychecks when we're doing well. And then she also had some sprinkling of fails governance of various activities. So for her, she has one company that has the financial functions, the accounting, and then that frontline customer service that is probably the most crucial to bring in that business of trying to get people to buy the title insurance. So it was very interesting to see how most of us are very aligned with Weber, and Daisy has kind of all of it mixed into one, and it's that private sector element.
Great. Yeah, and it's always good to see that distinction and some of the similarities between private and public. And you're right, the Weberian elements, especially if it's a larger private organization, we tend to see those Weberian elements in larger private organizations, just like we do in large public organizations. It's those instrumental rewards, as you talked about, that really do differ between the sectors. And we're very limited in the public sector, especially with those extrinsic types of instrumental rewards. And that has some profound implications for how we can measure performance. And we'll talk a lot about that next week when we get into our neoclassical theories and talk about HR and HRM and some of the ways we can motivate our employees and some of the limitations we have on how we can motivate our employees. So very well done. Yeah, it's always good to see that private public type of differences. So very good. Thank you, Crystal. Well, thank you, everyone. I think that's you're going to be doing this again, obviously, on your organizational analysis paper. You're going to be doing this again in future beach board postings. So I just think it's really nice for you to have the opportunity to do this as groups so that you can see some of those similarities and differences between your organizations. We're going to build on this information the next week when we talk neoclassical theory, because we're going to talk about how can we incorporate those neoclassical theories into a classical type of organization? Because certainly the similarity between all four groups is that most of our organizations really do have those classical components to them. So how can we take the neoclassical elements and incorporate them into a classical organization, or do what Douglas McGregor says, take our theory Y elements and incorporate them into a classical theory X organization? And we'll talk about some of those strategies next week when we talk neoclassical theories. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. That's pretty much all I have for this evening. Remember, you have Beach Board number 2, your public-private differences, due on Sunday. Then for next week, we are going to start out next week in neoclassical theory, talking about my favorite author, Mary Parker Follett. And I'll spend a good bit of time talking about Mary Parker Follett. We'll talk about some human relations theorists like Elton Mayo, Fritz Roethlisberger. Then we'll turn our attention to human resource management theorists. We'll talk about the differences between human relations and human resource management theory and why we make a distinction between the two. And then talk about some of the mainline human resource management theorists such as Maslow, McGregor, Ardress, and really draw some distinctions between what we talked about this week and the neoclassical theories we'll talk about next week. Sound good? Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you have a good evening. Have a great week. As always, any questions you have throughout the week, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, we'll be back at it next Monday night. So thanks. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.